What if the loudest change begins in silence? Not with celebration, not with slogans, but in that quiet moment when something shifts, and you can feel it, even before you can explain it. Welcome to the National Diary, a place where we don't rush to conclusions. We pause, observe, and understand. Where stories are not told to comfort, but to reveal. Because what shapes a nation is rarely just what happens, it's how it happens, and what it leaves behind. Here, we look beyond the obvious, beyond headlines and noise, into the deeper currents of power, of people, of choices that define direction. Because every turning point carries two things: promise and consequence. And the difference between the two? Clarity. In a time where narratives compete to be heard, we focus on what needs to be understood. No shortcuts, no distractions, just perspective that stays with you long after the video ends. We ask the questions others move past. We connect the dots that don't always seem visible. And sometimes, we sit with the discomfort, because that's where truth usually hides. This isn't about sides. It's about seeing clearly. This is the National Diary.
There was a time when Bengal was not just a place on a map. It was the heartbeat of India's awakening. A land where ideas were sharper than swords, where poetry carried rebellion, and where intellect stood taller than power. Bengal was not merely living history, it was writing it. This was the soil that nurtured reformers, thinkers, revolutionaries. The Bengal Renaissance was not just a cultural movement, it was a quiet revolution of the mind. It challenged orthodoxy, questioned injustice, and redefined what it meant to be Indian under colonial rule. Education flourished, literature soared, and a sense of identity began to take shape. Bengal became the torchbearer of modern India. Then came industry, jute mills humming along the Hooghly, ports bustling with trade, railways stitching the region into the larger fabric of the country. Kolkata stood as a symbol of economic power, a city of opportunity, ambition, and growth. Bengal was not just culturally rich, it was economically formidable. It had pride, purpose, and a future that seemed unstoppable. But somewhere along the way, something began to fracture. Politics, which once carried the promise of representation and progress, slowly hardened into ideology and control. The rise of the left brought with it a vision: land reforms, workers' rights, redistribution. For many, it was hope. For others, it became the beginning of stagnation. Factories that once roared with life began to fall silent. Investors grew wary. Strikes became frequent, sometimes endless. The same working class empowerment that was meant to uplift began to choke productivity. And yet it wasn't just economic decline, it was something deeper, more painful. A culture of political violence began to seep into everyday life. Not overnight, but steadily. Party lines were no longer just differences of opinion. They became boundaries of fear. From towns to communities to universities, everywhere allegiance mattered. To belong to the wrong side was not just inconvenient. It could be dangerous. Then came a shift. The left, after decades in power, gave way to a new force, the TMC. There was hope again. People wanted change, wanted revival, wanted Bengal to rise once more. And for a moment, it felt possible. But the shadows didn't disappear. Instead, the pattern seemed to repeat itself. Only the players had changed. Allegations of political intimidation, clashes between cadres, cycles of retaliation. Violence didn't vanish, it evolved. Elections, which should have been celebrations of democracy, often turned into battlegrounds. Stories of booth capturing, intimidation, and bloodshed began to surface with disturbing regularity. For the common person, it became exhausting. Imagine growing up in a place where your vote could define your safety, where your silence might be mistaken for opposition, where choosing not to participate in politics still doesn't keep you safe from it. That is the quiet tragedy Bengal has lived through. And yet, beneath all this, there is something incredibly resilient about Bengal. Because even in decay, it remembers what it once was. In its literature, in its music, in its intellectual debates, there is still a spark. You can still hear echoes of that Renaissance spirit in classrooms, in coffee house conversations, in theater and art. The soul of Bengal hasn't died. It has been buried under layers of conflict, waiting for a chance to breathe again. The real question is not who is to blame, the left or the TMC. That debate, while important politically, misses the larger point. The deeper issue is how a land of such immense cultural and intellectual wealth became trapped in cycles of power struggles and violence. Power, when it becomes the end goal rather than a means, corrupts the very system it is supposed to serve. And Bengal, over decades, has seen power being protected at all costs, sometimes even at the cost of its own people. What was once a land of thinkers has, at times, been reduced to a land of survivors. But history also teaches something else. Bengal has reinvented itself before. It has risen from colonial oppression, from partition, from economic upheaval. It has the capacity to rise again. But that rise cannot come from political dominance alone. It has to come from restoring trust in institutions, in democracy, in each other. It has to come from rejecting violence, not just in action, but in thought. Because the true strength of Bengal was never in its rulers. It was in its people, their intellect, their courage, their refusal to accept injustice. That spirit still exists. It just needs space to grow again. And so, we arrive at the present, not as outsiders looking in, but as inheritors of a legacy that feels both glorious and wounded. Because what Bengal faces today is not just a continuation of its past struggles. It is a more layered, more immediate crisis. One that touches identity, livelihood, governance, and the fragile thread that holds society together, trust. There is a growing unease. Not always loud, not always visible, but present in conversations, in silences, in the way people measure their words more carefully than before. One of the most sensitive and widely discussed concerns is the question of illegal immigration from across the eastern border. For many, this is not just about movement of people. It is about identity, demographic balance, and pressure on already limited resources. There is a belief among sections of society that political interests across different regimes have at times chosen short-term electoral gains over long-term national and regional stability. And when borders begin to feel porous, not just physically but administratively, it raises deeper questions. Because a border state is not just responsible for itself. It carries the weight of the nation's security on its shoulders. Concerns around border management have increasingly entered public discourse. Issues like infiltration, smuggling networks, and undocumented movement. These are not abstract fears. They are tied to real anxieties about internal security, law enforcement capacity, and the ability of institutions to respond effectively. When governance appears inconsistent, when coordination feels weak, people begin to worry, not just about their locality, but about the larger implications for the country. There is a sentiment among many that successive political forces, whether during the long left rule or under the current leadership, have not always treated this challenge with the seriousness it demands. That political calculations have, at times, diluted the urgency of national security concerns. Whether one agrees fully or partially, the fact remains, this perception has taken hold. And perception in matters of security carries weight. Because once people begin to feel that the safety of the nation can be compromised for political advantage, it creates not just fear, but disillusionment. This ties directly into the broader issue of trust. Trust in governance. Trust in institutions. Trust that decisions are being made not just for power, but for protection. Alongside this, the economic struggle continues to cast a long shadow. From being an industrial powerhouse to now fighting to attract sustained investment, Bengal's economic journey has been one of gradual decline. Opportunities exist, but they often feel limited or uncertain. Businesses hesitate, citing instability or unpredictability. And in that hesitation, growth slows. And when growth slows, people leave. The brain drain is no longer just a pattern. It is a quiet exodus. The most talented minds, the most driven individuals, are building futures elsewhere. Not out of disloyalty, but out of necessity. They seek environments where effort meets opportunity, where ambition is rewarded with stability. Each departure is silent, but together, they create an absence that is deeply felt. Unemployment deepens this crisis. Degrees do not guarantee livelihoods. Aspirations shrink, And frustration, when left unaddressed, begins to harden. Law and order remains a recurring concern in public perception. Incidents of political clashes, allegations of intimidation, and localized tensions continue to surface. For many, neutrality feels fragile, as if staying uninvolved is not always enough to remain unaffected. And when safety begins to feel conditional, democracy begins to feel distant. Corruption, or even the perception of it, further erodes confidence. When systems appear influenced, when fairness feels negotiable, people begin to disengage. Not because they don't care, but because they feel unheard. Education, once Bengal's crown jewel, still produces brilliance, but struggles to fully retain it. Healthcare, infrastructure, and rural-urban disparities continue to demand attention. Development exists, but often unevenly distributed. And perhaps the most dangerous shift is this: the normalization of all these challenges. When people begin to accept compromise as routine, when questions are replaced by resignation, when silence feels safer than expression, that is when the spirit of a society begins to dim. But Bengal has not lost its spirit. It is strained, yes. Conflicted, certainly, but not gone. Because even now, there are voices that question, minds that innovate, individuals who refuse to accept decline as destiny. There are citizens who still believe that governance can improve, that accountability can return, that security, both local and national, can be strengthened without division. Bengal stands at a crossroads. One path leads deeper into cycles of distrust, political calculation, and stagnation. The other demands courage. Courage to prioritize long-term stability over short-term gains, to secure borders without creating internal divides, to rebuild an economy that retains its people instead of losing them. The future of Bengal is not just a regional question, it is a national one. Because when a border state thrives, the nation feels stronger. And when it struggles, the impact travels far beyond its boundaries. The question is not whether Bengal has the capacity to rise again. It always has. The question is whether it can align its politics, its governance, and its people toward that shared purpose once more. The story of Bengal is not over. It is paused, caught between memory and possibility. And maybe, just maybe, the next chapter will not be written in fear or blood, but in the same ink that once defined it, of ideas, resilience, and hope. And now, the pause breaks. Not gently, not quietly, but with the force of a decisive moment that Bengal has not witnessed in a long time. After years of tension, debate, accusation, and uncertainty, the people have spoken. The political landscape that once seemed immovable has shifted. The BJP has swept the state, turning what was once a distant ambition into a defining reality. But this moment did not emerge overnight, because to understand today, you have to remember yesterday. There was a time not too long ago when this same party fought hard, surged with momentum, and yet fell short. The 2021 election was not a defeat in the traditional sense. It was a signal. It showed that the ground beneath Bengal's politics was already shifting, that there was a growing section of people willing to consider an alternative. The numbers may not have delivered power then, but they revealed something deeper. Change had already begun in the minds of the people, and over time, that undercurrent became a wave. The campaign leading up to this moment was not just about promises, it was about positioning. It tapped into the frustrations that had been building for years. Concerns over governance, law and order, economic stagnation, border security, and the feeling that Bengal had been held back from its full potential. It spoke directly to those who felt unheard, those who wanted both development and stability, those who wanted Bengal to reclaim its place, not just culturally, but economically and strategically. And this time, that message resonated louder than ever. Because people were not just voting against something, they were voting for a possibility. A possibility shaped by examples beyond Bengal. States like Gujarat have long been presented as models of industrial growth and infrastructure development, where investment flows more freely, where business ecosystems have matured over time. UP, once often associated with instability, has in recent years projected an image of improved law and order alongside rapid infrastructure expansion, expressways, airports, and industrial corridors redefining its identity. And Assam, a border state like Bengal, has been highlighted for its efforts in addressing infiltration concerns while also pushing development and connectivity in the Northeast. These examples have been part of a larger narrative, one that connects governance with outcomes and outcomes with trust. And for many in Bengal, that narrative has now become an expectation. Because beyond roads and industries, there is another dimension that has weighed heavily on people's minds: national security. For a state that shares an international border, this is not a distant concern. It is immediate, personal. The promise of stronger border management, firmer policy implementation, and clearer coordination between state and central forces has played a significant role in shaping this mandate. The idea that security, both internal and national, can be strengthened without ambiguity has found resonance. But victory, however decisive, is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a far more difficult chapter, because expectations now are not abstract, they are immediate. People will not measure this change in speeches or slogans, but in outcomes, in jobs created, in industries revived, in whether young people choose to stay instead of leave, in whether elections become peaceful expressions rather than tense confrontations, in whether governance feels fair, consistent, and accessible. The weight of history is heavy here. Bengal has seen promises before, it has believed before, and it has been disappointed before, which is why this moment carries both hope and caution. Hope, because change has finally been given a chance. Caution, because that chance must now be justified. If this new chapter can truly address the concerns that have defined the present, economic decline, brain drain, governance challenges, border security, then Bengal may not just recover, it may redefine itself once again. But that will require more than political victory. It will require discipline, vision, and above all, accountability. Because Bengal does not need another phase of dominance. It needs a phase of rebuilding, a return to what once made it extraordinary. Not just power, but purpose. Not just leadership, but direction. And perhaps, standing at this turning point, there is a sense that history is watching again, waiting to see if Bengal will rise, not in fragments, not in conflict, but as a united force of intellect, industry, and identity. And now comes the hardest part, not winning power, but using it well. Because history has seen victories before. What it remembers, however, is what followed them. For the BJP, this moment in Bengal is not just an opportunity. It is a test of whether it can translate momentum into meaningful, lasting change. A test of whether it can break patterns instead of becoming a part of them. Because Bengal does not need another cycle of control. It needs correction. The first and most immediate challenge is restoring trust in governance. Not through speeches, but through visible, measurable action. Law and order must become predictable, not political. That means depoliticizing the police at the ground level, ensuring swift action against violence regardless of affiliation, and sending a clear message that the rule of law stands above party lines. If people begin to feel safe without needing protection from any political identity, half the battle is already won. Then comes border security, one of the most sensitive and strategic aspects of Bengal's reality. This cannot be approached with rhetoric alone. It requires coordination between state machinery and central forces, technological surveillance, stronger intelligence networks, and administrative clarity. The focus must be on identifying illegal networks, whether related to infiltration, trafficking, or smuggling, without turning communities into targets. The line between security and social harmony is thin, and crossing it recklessly would create more instability than it solves. A strong border policy must feel firm, but fair. Parallel to this is the issue of identity and documentation. A transparent, legally sound framework is needed, one that reassures genuine citizens while addressing illegal entry through due process. Confusion breeds fear, and fear divides society. Clarity, on the other hand, builds confidence. But governance cannot survive on security alone. The economy must move. and it must move fast. Bengal needs a revival strategy that is both ambitious and practical. The first step is restoring investor confidence. This means simplifying approvals, ensuring policy stability, and actively engaging with industries rather than just inviting them. Land, labor, and logistics, the three pillars of industrial growth, must be addressed without ideological rigidity. Reviving old industrial belts while simultaneously creating new economic corridors could redefine the state's trajectory. Ports, manufacturing hubs, IT parks, and MSME clusters, these are not just projects, they are lifelines. And if executed correctly, they can begin reversing the outflow of talent. Because brain drain is not irreversible. Give people a reason to stay and they will. Skill development must be aligned with real industry needs. Not generic training, but targeted programs, technology, manufacturing, logistics, healthcare. Bengal's youth are capable. What they need is direction and opportunity. Agriculture, too, cannot be ignored. Strengthening supply chains, improving storage infrastructure, and ensuring fair pricing mechanisms can stabilize rural incomes. When villages prosper, migration reduces. When rural economies strengthen, the pressure on cities eases. At the same time, governance must become visible at the grassroots. Local administration should be empowered, but also held accountable. Digital transparency, whether in welfare distribution, public works, or grievance redressal, can reduce corruption and rebuild faith. People should not have to know someone to access what is rightfully theirs. Education and healthcare must be treated as long-term investments, not short-term optics. Upgrading institutions, attracting talent back into the state, and modernizing curriculum can slowly restore Bengal's intellectual leadership. Healthcare infrastructure, especially in rural areas, must expand in both reach and quality. But perhaps the most delicate challenge is political culture itself. If this new phase becomes about revenge, it will fail before it begins. The cycle of retribution must end here. Governance must rise above past conflicts. Inclusion, not in slogans, but in action, will determine whether Bengal stabilizes or fragments further. Opposition must exist, dissent must be allowed, and criticism must be heard without being treated as hostility. Because strong leadership is not about silencing voices. It is about managing them without fear. And finally, communication. People must not just see change, they must understand it. Clear, consistent communication about policies, decisions, and outcomes can prevent misinformation and build collective ownership. When people feel involved, they defend progress themselves. This is the roadmap, not perfect, not easy, but necessary. Because Bengal is not a state that can be governed casually. It demands depth, patience, and respect for its complexity. If handled with clarity and commitment, this moment could mark the beginning of something rare, not just a political shift, but a structural transformation. But if handled carelessly, it risks becoming just another chapter in a long cycle of missed opportunities. The responsibility now is immense, not just to win, but to prove that the victory meant something.